Welcome back. So last week we started the Thinking Tuesdays version of this by looking at the Jewish calendar, how we get the months, the years, and the breakup within the days. And now we're going to start going through the Jewish calendar in order of the months as the Bible defines them, not for any other reason than we're right around Passover. So why would I start with Rosh Hashanah now? Doesn't make a lot of sense. So we'll do Passover and counting the Omer, which for a lot of people probably is a practice that doesn't make a lot of sense. Um, Even people who do it, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense. There's a lot of rules about it we won't cover because goodness knows you don't need to know how to answer somebody's question when they ask you what day of the Omer it is because they're counting. So we won't worry about that unless you're really curious, which you shouldn't be, but I can answer that question. Um, so Passover and the Omer, and the goals will be review the origins of Passover and some of its history, review basic practices and customs, and I mean at a really basic level because we're going to really talk more about how we get the overall scheme of Passover that we have today. Last year we really went into how the Seder Plate is put together and how the Seder is put together and what's in there, um, and the history of the development of the Seder and of the Haggadah and all that other stuff. And this time we'll be looking kind of more at just how does the holiday get to be a thing that we recognize. So that's what the first two will be, and then learn about the basics for the period of Sefirat HaOmer, the counting of the Omer, including Lag BaOmer, which we'll throw in at the end because it's a holiday and not. Um, and it's the 33rd day, not the 32nd day. But my brain is tired. So, who knows one? Passover's origins and history. Um, that is, as you know, a Seder plate. Um, Last year I mentioned that there are actually 3 or 4 different configurations of Seder plate that are considered more or less customary. We don't really have to belabor that part. Jack, you got a question?
Only that the only slide showing is the title slide. And from
Oh,
what you're talking about sounds like you're moving on.
you are correct. So we're doing this again. Okay, so this happens every so often. Okay, what do we see now?
Just that you've started screen sharing.
Okay, so usually if we give it a few seconds, it catches up.
In the meantime, will you tell us what an Omer is?
Yeah, well, so that's the whole second half, but
Oh,
we
sorry.
could we could start with the Omer first because there's no great pictures of that, um, and then we can come back to Passover. Let's. It's easier. I'm just gonna flip through my.
Yeah, it's good now. It's
Okay.
everything's visible of what you're flipping through.
All right. So everybody, close your eyes so I can go back to the beginning. But Omer, as a word, just means sheaf. So it's like a sheaf of wheat is a measurement. What the Omer is in its broader function around Passover is more what we'll talk about than how to measure a sheaf of wheat because I don't have the full details on that. So the Seder plate that's up there is one of a possible number of models. Um, there's a number of different customs for how they get put together. There's no rules really, unless you ask Hungarians. Hungarians think there's rules for everything. Hungarian Jews, they're very particularly strict on Jewish law stuff. So the very beginning of Passover, as we see it in the Torah, is this verse that says, "For 7 days you shall eat matzah. On the first day you shall quit all leaven." So there's 2 different words being used from your homes, because every person eating leaven, chametz, that soul will be cut off from Israel from the first day until the seventh. So starting with just being cut off from Israel, being cut off from Israel means something different now than it did back then. Being cut off from Israel back then was like capital punishment. Being cut off now is understood to be you could be excommunicated, but really what happens is when you die and there's an afterlife, you'll be in trouble. Mostly people don't really get excommunicated very much these days anymore. There are exceptions. But that's what the cutoff means when you see it in the Torah these days. What it means in Orthodox Jewish circles is, in theory, we would excommunicate you. In reality, we think you're going to have some stuff to answer for after you die. But it says, for 7 days you'll eat matzot. On the first day, quit all leaven from your homes. So the broader pattern of how we find people who follow all of the rules for Passover dealing with leaven is not the same as what we see here. Because this says on the first day of Passover, get all the leaven out of your homes. Most people have the leaven out of their homes well before then. And you can't have it in your home, you can't eat it, etc., etc., etc. In case you're wondering, yes, this extends to pet food, among other things. So biblical era Passover breaks down into 3 basic commandments. You don't have leaven anywhere in Israelite communities. So nowhere in your gates is how it's expressed sometimes. There's an expectation that you'll participate in eating the Passover lamb, which is and is not a sacrifice, and I'll explain what's happening there in a moment, with none left or retained after the night. So a family is supposed to cook its own lamb. If there's not enough in the family to justify that, they're supposed to go in with another family, eat it all in one night with bitter herbs and matzah. There's no explanation for bitter herbs. It just shows up in there, and it shows up in numbers, and you're just supposed to do it. There's no real explaining why. And the third one is you're supposed to teach your children. Right, so this turns into matzah, maror, mentioning the Passover lamb, although not doing it anymore. And we'll talk about why we don't do it anymore. And then what we recognize as the precursor to the Seder. You're supposed to explain to your children what's happening. The first 2 commandments are connected to haste, right? So the Passover lamb should be eaten with loins girded, sandals on, staff in hand, and hurriedly. I really wish I had found my loins girded image. I have a diagram that explains what that means. Because until you see this diagram, it's a little bit unclear. But basically it means taking the robe that you would wear and wrapping it around in a particular way so that it's out of the way so you can move quickly. So, eaten with loins girded, sandals on, staff in hand, and in a hurry. And matzah cakes were baked so that people took their dough before it was leavened, right? We have this story that the Israelites were not just leaving Egypt, they were getting pushed out of Egypt. And since they were being pushed out of Egypt, they didn't have time to let the dough rise, so they just kind of carried it with them and cooked it on the way. You kind of need a stone oven to really make matzah work. And so I have some questions about the reality of this, but I guess we can set that to the side. This is the kind of memory of it that's in the Torah. Bake matzah, eat Passover lamb, everything's related to you're in a hurry. Each of those 2 commandments, eating the lamb and eating the matzah, are actually issued as requirements before there's any explanation. So it is only after we get the you're going to eat the Passover lamb with matzah, etc., that we get the story of why. Being in a hurry comes at the end. The commandments regarding matzah don't get their explanation until after you get the rules. It's pretty common for no explanation to be given by the Torah for any of its rules, so that there are explanations is interesting. because these aren't rules. When you get explanations for rules in the Torah, you're usually getting them because there's a specific situation that's arisen. When somebody will do XYZ thing, this is the rule. Here's the rule, let me explain why. That there's any explanation at all is a little unusual. Usually it's just, this is what you do. And what's really interesting about the commandments from a narrative setting, when we get these things in the middle of the Exodus story. So the way we actually finish Exodus chapter 11 before we get to these rules is actually Pharaoh has refused to let the Israelites go. And yet somehow the Israelites are getting instructions on what to do on their way out. Now the narrative itself kind of puts in a little verse at the end that says, well, Pharaoh was going to refuse in order to amplify the miracles that were going to be performed, right? Makes more of a ooh thing if you think you're not going anywhere, and then you have, let's face it, this is right before the death of the firstborn son, so it amplifies this really gruesome miracle. But we don't actually know that they're going anywhere yet. They get these instructions, here's what you're going to do, but no one said you're leaving. It's only after they get all of these instructions about what to do that they eventually get okay, now it's time to go. So this is all a guess before then, in terms of what Israelites would have known if you're sitting in that narrative setting, right? They wouldn't have known that they were going somewhere. But they're getting eat this food really fast, bake matzah. Why are we making anything unleavened? And it's kind of like, don't worry. A few verses later, you'll find out. I don't think anybody would have said to people that were alive, you'll find out in a few verses, but you know what I mean. We'll find out in a few verses. That's how the narrative goes. It's a hybrid holiday. So we have these instructions for how you eat the Passover lamb, and then there's some narrative. And then you get commandments for matzah, and there's some more narrative. Each one has different terminology, right? So Pesach is this word for lamb. Feast of the Unleavened Bread comes later. Matzah gets mentioned separately at one point, and there's no mention of a lamb, and there's no mention of bitter herb, right, of maror. So we've got two chunks of material that don't tie together real well. And this leads scholars to think that there actually were two separate spring holidays, one for shepherds, Pesach, that becomes Passover, right? The name carries forward for us. And one for farmers that's called Feast of the Unleavened Bread, and they were eventually combined. So this assumes that you're living in the land of Canaan. The northern part of the land of Canaan has the capacity for agriculture. The southern part of the land of Canaan does not have the capacity for growing plants very nicely, but it does have the ability to serve as a place for sheep and goats to be herded. So shepherds are in the south, agrarian, growers of grain are in the north. They each have a spring holiday because it's important for both of them, right? In the spring is when planting happens, and the spring is when sheep and goats have new herds. So the spring's important for both. The holidays are different. Eventually they come together as a group, and Passover becomes a hybrid thing. So you can read more about that in Chaim Schaus's The Jewish Festivals. The book goes by another name that I can't bring to mind at the moment, but whichever name, it's the same book. So either one, the same pages even, has his explanation for what's going on to maybe make two holidays into one. So we talked about matzah, we talked about the Passover lamb with bitter herb and matzah. And the other core commandment as it comes through over time is what we now call the Passover Seder. the biblical commandments don't actually say, have a Passover Seder. They instead have this kind of repetition of, your child will come to you and ask something, or you're just going to tell your child something, or your child will ask and they'll ask in a particular way and you'll give them information, and each time it mentions it, it's a little bit different. So we kind of maybe recognize these four ways of telling the story. What is this story for you? And you will say, you'll tell the story to your child. It will happen that your child will come and say, and when your child asks you in the future, we recognize these as the four, traditionally called the four sons. I'm going to tend to call it the four children because there's no obvious gender marker, or no necessary gender marker, right? Children of any gender can ask these questions. But we recognize these a lot of the time as being the predecessors for the four children in the Passover Haggadah. There's no specific tie of any of these verses in the text of the Torah itself to the four types of children. So we'll talk more about what happens that we get the four children in a lot of the Haggadot that we see. But these are the verses that those four children come from. A lot of the rest is the rabbis doing improv, but we get a really good clue that there's an expectation that you're going to do something to explain Passover to successive generations, explain why this is going on. So this is actually from the Leipnic Haggadah at the British Library. This is the page in the Leipnic Haggadah that has the four children, and they're portrayed as boys here. The wise one, the wicked one, the simple one, and the one who doesn't know how to ask. Note that the wicked one is a soldier. I'm not 100% sure what that's supposed to tell you, but this is obviously supposed to be a child who can't ask. This is a wise one, right? Book, finger, beard, looking stereotypically rabbinic for the time. And this is somebody who maybe is, a hunter or something, but he's not a soldier. Soldiers are bad. So this is the four sons, the four children. Last year, when we talked about the development of portions of the Haggadah, we didn't actually talk about the four children. We didn't talk about the four sons. So it's worth talking about them now and seeing where that stuff comes from. So these are the four verses again that the rabbis draw on to create the story of the four children. And the pop quiz is, on the back of a napkin or whatever, can you figure out which one of these is which child? I have the answer on the next slide, but see for yourself if you can look at these, if you remember that part of the Haggadah, and figure out which one of these is the wise one, which one's the wicked one, which one is the simple one, and which one is the one who doesn't know how to ask.
Are you wanting us to answer, or you're just saying we should?
Oh, no, think it through. You don't have to answer. I'm not going to put anybody on the spot. But if you want to take a guess, you're welcome to.
Well, so I think 13, 14 would be simple because the child is saying, "What is this?"
Yep. So that's the simple child.
Yeah. So I at least got one right.
Yep, that's the simple child.
So presumably 13:8 is the one who doesn't know how to ask because there's no asking in there. It's just you will tell him.
Right.
Right.
So do we remember which one the wicked one is?
I think it must be, "What is this service for you?"
Right.
But I can't quite remember.
That's the wicked child, and then the wise one is in Deuteronomy. When your child asks you in the future, what are the testimonies, the statutes, and the judgments? So there we have them. 1, 2, 3, and 4. There's nothing in these verses. There's nothing around these verses that has the Torah saying, hey, you know what? There are 4 types of children, and here they are. The child who asks it in this way is a bad child. That's just not what the Torah does. The Torah does the thing that the Torah does, where there's repetition, and we're left to decide what the repetition of an idea means. And the rabbis decided what the repetition means is, hey, we can do some midrash. We're going to do a little bit of interpretation and have some fun with this. Like, if you think midrash is fun, then what the rabbis do with it is fun. If you don't think midrash is fun, maybe it's not fun. So the 4 sons are not in the Torah. The 4 children are not in the Torah. A lot that's in the Haggadah actually is not in the Torah. Most of what's in the Haggadah that tells the story of Passover, that tells the Exodus story, actually isn't biblical text at all. So if you think about the passages that stick out for a lot of people year after year, the 10 plagues, there's no actual listing of the 10 plagues in the Torah. That's been written separately. There's this bit about Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. When you read it in the bullet point, it's not very familiar, but the story goes that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, it wasn't until I was like somebody who was 70 years old that I merited understanding why the Exodus is mentioned during both morning and evening prayers. This has nothing to do with telling the Passover story. He's quoting another person, Ben Zoma, who is not a rabbi, by the way, but Elazar ben Azariah is, and he says, I was only until I was a man of like 70 years old that I merited to know why, and it's this guy's interpretation, Ben Zoma's interpretation, that explained why, and it has to do with the exact phrasing of a verse. And he says, that's why. Because there's this exact phrasing of a verse, and I didn't really understand it, but he told me. And then there's this section that a lot of people find really uncomfortable in the Seder, where Rabbi Akiva and I think Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and a couple of other people are sitting there, and they're all kind of spitballing about how many plagues the Egyptians were smitten by. And they say, oh, well, it's not 10 plagues, it's 50, because each hand has 5 fingers, and so you get 50 plagues, because they start doing math to figure out how many plagues the Egyptians really were victimized by, and they get up to 200. And they debate it, and they're doing all kinds of interpretation on what is a hand, and well, but hand is actually, this is the numeric value of this, and this is the numeric value of that. Not in the Torah. The Torah gives no indication of more than 10 plagues. But this discussion goes on for a little while, and you're left looking at this discussion in the traditional Haggadah and going, what in the world are we telling these stories about? Because it's not great. You know, hey, we're going to spend some chunk of the evening of Passover discussing exactly how many times a group of people is punished. Most of what is in the traditional Haggadah does not come out of the biblical text. Most of what is in there is midrash. So what the rabbis are doing with the traditional Haggadah is they're not actually telling the Passover story. We think of the Seder as this is when we tell the story of Passover. The Haggadah isn't doing that. The Haggadah has a different agenda. It's giving you examples of how to interpret the story. Because there's all kinds of stuff that's missing that we would think is important about the Passover story if what you were trying to do was just tell it straight. Moses is not a character in the actual retelling of the story in the traditional Haggadah. He's not mentioned. He gets a couple mentions later on, but we're way outside of the story by that point. We're in, later parts of the Haggadah, and we're talking about other stuff, and he's not in the story. But Moses shows up in every panel of the Torah from Exodus 1 onward. The whole thing is called the 5 books of Moses because he's the main human character. He keeps turning up, but he's not in the Haggadah story. Because the Haggadah is doing something else. It's saying, we know you know this story, but watch us make this story our story. And the point of it is, you're supposed to, in the rabbinic idea, view it as though you personally went out of the land of Egypt. If you tell the same script every year, it depersonalizes it. So they want you to see that you can tell a different story. You don't go too far afield in their view, but you can tell a different story. You don't have to sit there and say, okay, we're going to read Exodus. What would you do? You would start reading it like Exodus 2? Or maybe some point in Genesis, and you would just start reading there and you would keep going until you got to, I don't know, wherever. Or maybe you would abridge it or something. The Haggadah doesn't do that. The Haggadah says, we're going to talk about things in the story, but we're going to talk about it in a different way. So it's doing Midrash to give permission to do something else other than just tell the story beat by beat. So let's stop there and do questions. If there are questions. Yeah, Jack.
But for the Orthodox, doesn't the Haggadah itself become kind of fossilized and just a required ritual, not opening it up for making the story one's own, admitting changes and so forth? At least that's my childhood experience.
Yeah, it depends on the Orthodox family. So a lot of families have the Haggadah and say, okay, well, we're going to follow this, but we're going to stop and have discussions about things in the middle. When you're a kid and this thing is taking 4 or 5 hours, you don't necessarily notice that that's happening. But it is in a lot of families. Not every family, but a lot of them. Part of the problem is the Haggadah as we know it has a really specific source that we get most of its text from. And it's the Code of Jewish Law that Maimonides wrote. So the Mishneh Torah, if you go to the section about Passover, it has all these laws about Passover, and then there's like an appendix to that section, and it's the Haggadah, and it's almost verbatim the Haggadah that we know now. So in addition to Maimonides figuring out how to do the calendar that we talked about last week and solidifying all these points of Jewish law, he put a fixed text for the Haggadah in that Code of Jewish Law, and it's super convenient to just take that text and use it. Particularly because in the Orthodox world, there's sometimes this fantasy that gets peddled around that everybody 300 years ago was a Talmid Chacham, was, well schooled in Torah and knew their Aramaic and their Hebrew and whatever, and we of this later generation are undereducated, and we need the crutch of these texts. Come on. Most people were or undereducated, and they needed the text too. So eventually that Haggadah starts to get commentaries to it. So close your eyes while I zip back a couple of slides. So this image of the sons, the four sons, and, in this text it's the four sons, the Leibniz Haggadah. So this is the actual text of the Haggadah, the larger Hebrew. This, on the right-hand margin and kind of below the text and between the text and the picture, says Perush Abravanel, Abravanel's interpretation. So this is a running commentary on the text of the Haggadah by a actually Renaissance era rabbi. So once Maimonides kind of set the text in stone a little bit, it started to accrue commentary, and the idea was that you would use the commentary to kind of liven up the text. Lots of people don't do that. It's made a little bit more difficult now in being flexible. I don't know why it says Johnny Appleseed there. I think that's the template being helpful. I don't know that Johnny Appleseed has questions about the Haggadah. It's made more difficult. There's relative lack of Jewish education. And then there's the ready accessibility of books that we can all read, like the Maxwell House Haggadah. So when people don't have the time or the chance or the interest or the opportunity or whatever it is to learn how to improvise on the text of the Haggadah, at least you can follow the text of the Haggadah. And then Maxwell House makes it convenient in the early 1900s to get a hold of copies of the Haggadah, because they'll give it to you free if you buy a Maxwell House product. They're, of course, trying to sell coffee, and they're worried that people will think that coffee beans are beans, which means that they're legumes, which means that for Ashkenazic Jews you can't have beans, so they're worried people won't buy coffee. Having the Haggadah is a nice way of communicating that coffee is kosher for Passover. Maxwell House's coffee is kosher for Passover. And in fact, at least at the Safeway down the block from me, buy a can of Maxwell House coffee and you can get a free Haggadah even today. The Haggadot are standing in a rack right next to a big display of Maxwell House. So the intent is to be a lot more flexible. The reality is, for lots of reasons, people just follow the text. The bare minimum is something different. The bare minimum is, according to the Mishnah, is you're supposed to mention the Passover sacrifice, eat matzah and maror, and tell some version of the story. That's the bare minimum. Anything else you can be flexible with. Over time, you get things being more and more and more strict. But it's all stuff that somebody made up, right? We've seen none of that's in the Torah. The stuff that's in the Torah is kill a lamb, eat the lamb, do it fast, have it with matzah, have it with bitter herb, say something. And then anything else is more than that. Other questions? Nobody wants to know where to get a Maxwell House Haggadah in Ellicott City. Okay. I mean, I'm happy to tell you. But so one of the big commandments out of the Torah is having the Passover lamb. Right? This is this thing that you're supposed to eat with the rest of your family. You're supposed to eat it in a hurry overnight. You're not supposed to leave anything over, and if you do, it's got to be burned, and you can't bring it with you. And the rabbis get all kinds of rules about what happens if you find a bit of the, I guess this was a problem. What happens if you find a little bit of leftover Passover lamb in your saddlebag 20 miles outside of Jerusalem? They ask these questions.
Jeremy, I'm sorry to interrupt. I
Oh,
had
sure.
to run off for a second. Actually, because I just got a vaccine appointment and I was so excited.
Okay, well, that's important.
Yeah. So, anyways, I wanted to ask, in that picture of that old Haggadah, it looked
Mhm.
like there were 3 younger people and then somebody that looked like a wise person. It didn't look like 4 children. Why is
Well,
that?
okay, so I can explain something else. Okay, I'm going to tie this together with, where did I'm going to tie this together with this. So there was this thing about 4 sons are in the Torah, but not in the Torah. And the story about Elazar ben Azariah saying, I was like somebody who was 70 years old before I had the merit to learn why we talk about the Exodus in morning and evening prayers. So this gets into rabbinic stories about themselves. And the rabbinic story here is Elazar ben Azariah is really young. He's like 18 or 19. And a dispute breaks out among the elder rabbis on the Sanhedrin. And finally, the lead rabbi, Rabban Gamliel, who we're going to talk about later, Rabban Gamliel pushes too far, and he throws somebody out of the house of study, and the response is that they demote him and he's no longer chief rabbi of the Sanhedrin. And they have to figure out who's going to replace him, and they think, well, maybe this person, maybe that person. And somebody says, how about Elazar ben Azariah? He's got a lot of money. I guess that's a good asset to have when you're the chief rabbi. He's got a lot of money. He's pretty smart. And he doesn't have any of the baggage with any of these people that got all in a snit. And so they offer him the job. He's 19 years old. And he goes home and he says to his wife, like, I got offered this job. What do I do? And she goes, you are too young. Your hair is a lustrous brown color. And he goes, you're right. I can't accept this job. He goes to sleep. He wakes up. His hair is stark white. He looks like a man who is 70. So I did not merit to know Ben Zoma's interpretation until I was like a man of 70, is literally how the Hebrew goes. So this son, this is the 4th son, this is the wise son. Hacham, right? This is the wise son. We're supposed to kind of draw the line there. This is going in Hebrew order, by the way, of sons. A wise son is gray before his years because that's what happened to Elazar ben Azariah. That's the representation that's happening in this image.
Wow, thank you. That's
It's a little deep, right? It's like you have to know what you're looking at to know what you're looking at. It is also, I think, noteworthy to just point out these are people being depicted in a Jewish text, which is not always viewed as an acceptable thing to do. So one of the early Haggadot manuscripts that we still have, we don't really have them back from, like 1500 years ago. One of the earlier ones we have is actually called the Bird's Head Haggadah. And it is called that because all of the people have human bodies, but the heads of birds, so that you're not depicting full humans. So that we have people depicted in this Haggadah is actually noteworthy. So other questions other than why is Johnny Appleseed there? Because that's just
Yes, I have a question.
okay.
So, Rabbi, can you suggest another modern way of referring to the four children to somehow get around using simple?
Mm.
I was thinking maybe four approaches to learning.
This is interesting. There's a lot of discussion about what to do with the four children. The wise, wicked, simple. I mean, the Hebrew word that's used is tam, which is understood to mean simple, is sometimes understood to mean unintelligent. So the Hebrew is what it is. You could say plain spoken, right? Because this is very much a what is this?
Yeah.
Or uninformed or something. What often happens is that the simple son is equated to a person with disabilities, which 15 years ago seemed like a great advance in the Jewish world, that we were taking notice of people with disabilities, except it assumes that people with disabilities are tam in the Hebrew sense, meaning unintelligent a lot
Right.
of the time, which is an inappropriate kind of thing to do. So you could go with plain spoken. You could also simply acknowledge that this is cruft that we've picked up over time. It turns out that there's lots of ways to be Jewish, and one of the ways that we don't pay very much mind to, even as humanistic Jews, is Karaite Judaism, which, depending on whether you ask the Karaites or you ask the rabbis, is either a heretical offshoot or a back to basics group that's getting it right, again, depending on who you ask. And the Karaite Haggadah does not have the four sons. The Karaite Haggadah has very little that is not in the Torah. So they don't even have that. They have those verses because those verses set forth the obligation to tell the Passover story, but they tell the Passover story as it appears in the Torah. So they don't throw a bunch of interpretive stuff out there. They use the text of the Torah.
I was thinking, and I could be just way off, but I was thinking of maybe going in the direction of what's the proof of this for the wise person? The wicked is what's in this for me? How do I benefit? How am I going to make a lot of money from this? The simple person is maybe, is it on the test? And the one who doesn't ask questions just doesn't ask questions. Could you repeat the notes?
Right. Doesn't ask questions or doesn't have the information needed to frame a question.
Right.
Right? Like at any given point in time, I would argue that we have been any one of those four models simply based on our encounter with whatever the subject matter is.
Right.
Right?
Okay.
Like at a certain point, you're 14 years old and you're sitting at the Seder table and you're like, why are you doing this to me?
Right. Who cares?
Right.
Right.
What's the
Okay.
point of this?
Okay,
And
that's good.
And now is when we give you the guilt trip of, well, we'd have been saved, but not you, you jerk. Right? I mean, that's the unfortunate part of the response in the Haggadah is the answer is, I would have been saved. Not you, not him, but you, and therefore he would not have been saved, right? The Haggadah lays it out and says, this is a criticism. But that's the Haggadah's interpretation. The whole framing of the four children is the Haggadah. It's not the Torah.
Or I was thinking not asking questions because you just accept authority, period.
Yeah, there's
So
a
that's yet another take.
yeah. I mean, that's actually the kind of thinking that the Haggadah is trying to encourage, right? The Haggadah is trying to say, you can do a lot with this. Think about it. You know, you need to make this your own because you're supposed to view yourself as though you went forth from Egypt.
Right.
If you don't do something to personalize some of this, it's not personal, and you haven't accomplished that goal.
Okay.
But again, you know, we teach stuff a lot of the times in a way that doesn't accomplish that.
Well, that's personal to me, that approach as a teacher. That's how you might think about
Yeah.
teaching something. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's thank you. Interesting.
I have another question,
Sure.
and it's only because I've been thinking last week when you mentioned that you did your degree on the New Testament. Is that
Yeah. I mean, ostensibly, yeah.
Yeah. So I just wanted to know if it was really true that the Last Supper was a Passover Seder.
Probably not. There's all kinds of problems with that. So, you know, you get churches that want to do a Passover Seder that's also supposed to be a model Last Supper kind of thing.
Right.
That's how evangelical churches have started to have Seders all of a sudden, right? Is, well, we're really just doing what Jesus did. Well, you're really not. So there are a few problems. One of them is you're not supposed to execute people on Passover, at least according to the New Testament. So how could you have a Passover Seder on the first night of Passover and kill that person the next day? That's a little bit problematic.
Yeah, but wasn't it the Roman authority who killed?
Yeah, they weren't so observant.
Right.
Well, the Romans weren't so observant, but nobody's supposed to be going and asking for people to be executed at all. You're supposed to be observing Passover. You're not supposed to be going to work and going to the Roman governor and saying, this guy's a troublemaker, kill him. So that's a problem.
Wouldn't that be an argument to say that that's not the case, that the Roman didn't need that push, and right? It doesn't mean that it didn't happen that way. It just means that, well, maybe the Jews really didn't do that after all.
Well, that's a possible argument. The story suggests something different, right? So we have the problem, the story being really, you know, well, the Jews did this. Every version of the story is really, well, the Jews did this in some way, shape, or form. Another big piece of it, and this is a bigger warning flag, is that the Romans probably knew better than to execute people right around a holiday for freedom. Like, if you want a revolt on your hands, that's what you do. And what the Romans really want to do is collect their tax money and have you leave them the heck alone. Because they don't really have enough soldiers there to put down a real rebellion. So the Romans have no reason to be doing this at this time. They'll wait a couple weeks.
Right.
No big hurry. We don't need to kill this person now. We can kill them 2 weeks from now when Passover is over, and we're not going to foment some gigantic revolt by killing some popular folk preacher. Passover was always a problematic time. Passover was a time when thousands of people who didn't live in Jerusalem came to Jerusalem. That's not the time you want to do this. So that gives you even more reason to think that it's not a Passover Seder, because this story really wouldn't happen plausibly during Passover. Maybe you put the guy in some dungeon for a couple of weeks, and then you sneak him back out. So you're not going to do this. So the story doesn't work as a thing that would actually happen during Passover, but it does work if you are trying to co-opt Passover and other holidays related to it for your new religion, which is, of course, what they were actually doing. It's really useful to know that when you look at the letters of Paul, Paul is the earliest Christian writer we know of. Paul's letters are from like the 40s, the 50s CE. The first gospel is from earliest 68 or 69 CE, so maybe a year before the destruction of the temple. Earliest. Paul is the earliest Christian writer we have. Paul doesn't mention Passover as being when Jesus died. And you'd think that that would be a big selling point for Paul, that he would make more of a deal out of it. It never comes up for some reason. Paul's not too hooked into like the everyday details of Jesus's life and existence, but he'd mention something big like that, and he doesn't. And that's a really big flag for the Gospels are telling a myth to support the founding of a new religion, not a straight history.
Very interesting. Thank you.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm remembering correctly, that when you're saying that in the Haggadah that you're supposed to view, part of it is to have the view of what it would be like as if you or one went out of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I like that phrase, and in contemporary terms, I can understand how that could take a lot of meaning, but how was it meant in biblical times if it wasn't like, hey, well, what can I do that's going to represent freedom? I mean, what did they mean that people should be doing?
They seem to be meaning that people, at least the rabbis seem to be meaning that people should be interpreting this stuff for themselves. That's the purpose of the Haggadah being what it is, you do have to have some freedom to interpret in order to view yourself as though you came forth out of Egypt. It's noteworthy that the Torah doesn't have that. The Torah doesn't say, okay, when you're done with the Seder, you should view yourself as though you came forth out of Egypt. You're always supposed to view yourself as though you came forth out of Egypt. There's no, okay, it's only at this time of year, or it's only the result of telling this story that you have that feeling. So what did they mean? In the biblical period, the reality was Egypt was your next door neighbor. And Egypt was generally not your friendly next door neighbor. Because, if you look at a map, you get a chance to remember that the land of Canaan is like in between these two giant empires, each of whom want it because it's the path to the other side. So it's pretty easy to just kind of feel yourself having some level of threat from Egypt and some kind of freedom from not being under Egyptian control. So that's one possibility. For a lot of Israelites, that was probably a pretty persuasive one, because Egypt and Assyria and Egypt and Babylon and Egypt and the Persians are sending troops towards each other through this land, right? We get the term Armageddon from Har Megiddo, the hill of Megiddo, where some big battle is supposed to happen. So there's a very immediate sort of free from Egyptian bondage kind of thing happening there. And then for people who existed after the return from the Babylonian exile, many of them did identify personally as having come forth from some kind of bondage, because they kind of did. But it's not commanded in quite the same way that the rabbis want to really spend a lot of time saying, well, you got to view yourself this way. It's just a matter of fact that you're an Israelite, and so you did come forth from the land of Egypt. And you're supposed to mention it twice a day, according to the rabbis. So you're kind of always supposed to have that sense.
Thank you.
but not a lot of broad philosophic guidance, right? That comes later. Other questions? I know that Johnny Appleseed supposedly wore a tin cap because that's the name of the Fort Wayne baseball team, and everything in Fort Wayne is about Johnny Appleseed. Okay, so feeling sheepish or why we don't get together for a big party with lambs. This is Latin, but I like the picture, so here we are. There's an easy answer, which is we don't have a temple in Jerusalem, so we don't sacrifice lambs anymore. Right? That's the kind of blanket answer that's given for why aren't there sacrifices anymore? Why is there a Seder? Why did all of this stuff in Judaism change? Second temple was destroyed. The rabbis reworked Judaism to be something other than a religion attached to the temple. And it is true that in the text of the Torah, it seems as though sacrifices are brought into the tabernacle. It seems as though the people congregate together to slaughter the Passover lambs and cook them. Right, so speak to the whole community of Israel and say on the 10th of the month, each shall take a lamb, watch over it until the 14th day, and all the assembled congregation of Israelites shall slaughter it at twilight. Okay, so everybody gets together and slaughters their Passover lambs. The text is not so clear that the priests are supposed to do this. The texts are not especially clear that this is quite the same kind of sacrifice as the routine sacrifices that go on in the temple. So there's a little bit of ambiguity. Not a ton, right? All the assembled congregation shall slaughter it at twilight seems to suggest everybody's supposed to get together in one place to do this. But it's not a slam dunk. Mishnah Pesachim, so this is from 200 CE. This is the rabbis describing how the Passover lambs were slaughtered, at least to their recollection, that families would travel to Jerusalem and maybe they would bring the lamb with them or they would buy one when they got there. Again, money changers in the temple. This is an important function. Last week we talked about how the money changers in the temple, Jesus attacking the money changers in the temple is an attack on temple-based Judaism. And here it is again, you buy an animal at the temple, so you don't have to bring one with you. So they would bring them to the temple. The slaughtering would be performed by the temple's priests. They would do it in 3 shifts because there were just too many people. So you'd take like a third of the people in to the central courtyard of the temple at once. Everybody's lamb would be slaughtered. They take blood from the lamb, and you can read the Mishnah if you really want to get a gruesome picture of how this all worked. I don't want to go into it too much. I guess we could talk about it after this. Later in the Mishnah, a chapter or so later, it says, it once happened that Rabban Gamliel told his servant Tavi, go out and roast us the Pesach on a grill. This is really notable for a couple of reasons. First of all, Mishnah Pesachim 7:1, the chunk right before it, says, how did they cook the Passover lamb? They put it on a spit made from the wood of a pomegranate tree. They did not toss a lamb on a grill. Rabban Gamliel is like the chief rabbi, and he's telling his servant, go toss it on the grill. So there's just a whole lot wrong here, just in that action. It does not match up with what's in the Mishnah, doesn't match up with the rule, so that's one problem. Then the other one is, where's he going to? Who's going wherever? You're with one, according to the way that Mishnah Pesachim 5 says, you're with 1/3 of the people who are in Jerusalem at the time, in a courtyard of the temple. Where are you going? You've got a spit from a pomegranate tree branch. Go where? So this story is it's a very short thing, right? It once happened that Rabban Gamliel told the servant Tavi, go out and roast us the Pesach on the grill, period. And then we move on. And it's just this throwaway line. But it's got a lot of stuff in it that's not quite right. At least at some point, this means that it seems like the most authoritative rabbi of his time was doing Passover at home or not at the temple, sending his servant out to put this lamb on a grill, not on a spit from a pomegranate tree branch. That's pretty noteworthy because he's the chief rabbi. This is his job. He's the guy in charge. There are two rabbis named this. One died around 52 CE, before the destruction of the Second Temple, which makes it really unlikely that he's the one who would have done this. One of them sometime after 95 CE, but before like 100 CE. Who's after? If it's this one, the second one, this is the one that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah replaced. But if it's this one, if it's the second one, he kept doing Passover as a sacrifice when there was no temple. So either his grandfather was doing it at home instead of bothering to go to Jerusalem, or he was doing it at home when there was no temple as the chief rabbi. So there's a little bit of confusion and weirdness here. And it suggests that not everybody was willing to let go of doing Passover with a lamb just because there was no more temple. And there's an ambiguity in the Torah here because it says, you shall keep watch over it, and all the assembled congregation of the Israelites shall slaughter it at twilight. Not, all the assembled congregation shall bring their lambs to the priests who will slaughter it at twilight. But they will do it, which suggests that if they can't all get together, they could still do it at home. So maybe somebody was still doing it for a while. The Talmud really doesn't say anything much about this. It just leaves it be, so you're kind of filling in gaps with information that you maybe do or don't have. And in the 18th century, so you got to take that with a grain of salt, but it's the most authoritative thing that there is. An 18th century Danish rabbi, Jacob Emden, reports that the Rabban Gamliel in question was the later one, so that this occurred after the destruction of the Second Temple. But, yeah, he did it, but within a couple of generations, the Sanhedrin came around and said, nobody's allowed to do this anymore. Because this is too problematic. It's too hard to do. When you slaughter an animal, it has to be slaughtered kosher. That's hard to do. Rabban Gamliel would know how to do it, but your average person in the street, Ploni Aloni, the average person on the street, that guy doesn't know what he's doing. So we don't want people to do that, and we're actually going to excommunicate them if they do it, because it's just too complicated. Too complicated for them to do, and confusing, and we're not supposed to be doing sacrifices anymore. And by this point, there was a sense that pretty much everybody was ritually impure, so nobody should be doing sacrifices for that reason as well. But there's ambiguity. But this is the story of how we don't even do this anymore. This makes us a little unusual. Because some Karaites still do some kind of a lamb slaughter thing, and Samaritans actively do this. they have an annual Passover lamb slaughtering event every year at Mount Gerizim. There's not that many Samaritans left, but they still do it. You can go on Wikipedia and find photos. So this is still a thing for some people connected into Judaism in some way. And every few years, a few enterprising, we should call them enterprising, yeshivaniks from Israel decide that they're going to try to sneak a lamb somewhere onto the Temple Mount and do this. So you can go find newspaper reports from Haaretz where they say, some guys tried to sneak a lamb on and have Passover on the Temple Mount, which means kind of like, near the Dome of the Rock. So near a mosque, they're going to try to do this. And every year that they do it, the Israeli police find them and they drag them away, and they're trying to revive the temple and bring the Messiah and all that other stuff. So some people are still trying to do this. We don't do it, and we don't do it ultimately because we're at the tail end of 2,000 years of not doing it. And
So
I don't know that a lot of us would want to do it, but that's the origin of us not doing it.
I have a question.
Mhm.
So Rabbi, are you saying that you think this was a communal task because of the nature of the task itself being dangerous and difficult, and then being a sacrifice to boot? So my question is, was there any element of desire to do something communally as opposed to individually, just because it was communal? It was a getting together and doing it, or is it strictly the nature of the task?
So I don't necessarily think it's the way that Torah presents it. It's not really the nature of the task, because honestly, it was pretty common for people to slaughter their own meat or to go to the person next door who was a butcher. You don't really need a priest to do that. So some facet of it is that it's a sacrifice and those are to be done in a particular way. The description of it in the Mishnah as to what the scene looked like was that a third of the people who were there would come in at a time with their lambs. Priests would circulate out around them. You had to have a lot of priests to do this, I think. Priests would circulate out around them, would slaughter the animal. Each priest had a bowl, would catch blood from the animal, and then it was like a conveyor belt of priests. So there were priests who didn't move, and the priest who had the bowl hands it to the next priest, who hands it to the next priest, who hands it to the next one, who hands it to the next one, who finally gets to the end of the chain, and the priest at the end of the chain splatters the blood from the bowl on the altar and passes the bowl back, and they do the next animal. That's the picture. So there's lots and lots and lots of animals being killed. There's lots and lots and lots of blood. It's a picture. So that becomes a religious obligation to participate in that. So that's why you have people gathering together in one place, ultimately, is we're taking this thing that the Torah portrays as people gathering together to do it, but then going back to their own homes and taking the blood with them. We don't do that anymore. We do this other thing. And the other thing is we all get together. The priests supervise the whole thing. They take the fats from inside the animal. And there's I lack an adjective at the moment other than kind of gross if you have a mental picture of it. So that's what they did. And at that point, it's fairly technical work, and you want to have the right people doing it, which is how you end up with priests doing it at the temple. And the idea that you don't do it at home. Although Rabban Gamliel, either the first or the second, seems to have done this at home. But he's Rabban Gamliel. Maybe he knows how to do it. I certainly don't know how to do it. This is not things you learn in rabbinical school. Maybe in Orthodox rabbinical school, but not everybody.
But all the indication is that he was kind of a man of resources as well, as we saw that they required that, right? And he had a person that worked for him. So it seems to be not necessarily the same condition that everybody would find themselves on that time, right?
Yeah, Rabban Gamliel is known to be wealthy. He is the first in the line of rabbis who are said to have been nasi, which is translated as prince sometimes in English translations of rabbinical literature, but the idea is this is the person who interfaces with the Roman authorities. So that person has to have a lot of money because part of that person's job is paying off the Romans. So yeah, Rabban Gamliel has resources, both material and intellectual and technical and whatever else, to be able to do it right. Although the Mishnah also kind of says you're not supposed to use a grill, and he seems to be using a grill. And I could come up with explanations for that, but we just don't have anything roughly contemporaneous to any of this to know what the thinking was. We just have this story. And when I went looking at this in the Talmud, it really didn't do much with this in terms of explanation. It's like the 18th century before anybody really has an explanation of this that people seem to accept. And an 18th century rabbi, I don't know where a rabbi living 1,500 years after 1,700 years after the person being talked about, I don't know where he gets that story from. Seems like a lot of inference to me and just reading into stuff. But yeah, Rabban Gamliel would have capacity that other people wouldn't have. So left without a Passover lamb, we have Passover kind of as we know it. No chametz, and over time there will be more and more stricture on what that means. People will start selling their chametz and all kinds of other things. The obligation to tell the Passover story remains. The obligation to eat matzah and bitter herbs remains. But most of the other stuff we do, this should be 4 questions with an S. 4 questions, Seder plates, charoset. This is stuff the rabbis invented. And it's specifically the rabbis because Karaite Jews don't do the 4 questions, don't have Seder plates, in fact, don't drink alcohol during Passover, don't eat cheese during Passover. Because how do you make those? Fermentation. What is chametz? Fermented stuff. So chametz is related to the Hebrew word chometz. Chometz is vinegar. Right? Fermented, it's wine that's then fermented another step. So Karaite Jews don't do even some of the stuff that we see in the Seders that we do today. They don't have charoset. They don't have the elaborate choreography of the Seder in the same way. Their Haggadah is drawn mostly from the Tanakh. You can actually download a Hebrew and English version of the Karaite Tanakh from Cairo, Egypt. It's available online. The Karaites are actually quite happy to offer a lot of their things online as downloadable PDFs because it's good PR for them. And so they have their own Haggadah, and it doesn't look like the traditional Jewish Haggadah, nor does it even look necessarily like a humanistic one, for sure, because they're just pulling stuff out of the Torah, and you're reading stuff out of the Torah or from Psalms or whatever it is, and their the version of their Haggadah that you can download from the internet actually has the text, bolds the text that is not from the Tanakh, so that you can see how little they've added that isn't in the Bible somewhere, because part of their point is to show you how far afield Rabbinic Judaism goes. And even though this is humanistic Judaism, and technically we're not looking at ourselves as Jews who are committed to rabbinic halacha, the fact of the matter is we are 2,000 years down the line of rabbinic development. So we are, as much as we're close to anything, we're probably closer to Rabbinic Judaism and certainly rabbinic customs than we are Karaite Judaism. But I mentioned Rabban Gamliel and this weird story about him and the Karaites because we do have options. We take for granted that Passover should look like, and what Passover should look like is basically a humanistic version of rabbinic Passover. It doesn't have to look like that, right? The idea is that it should look like what we need it to look like. Not necessarily, okay, well, we've got the humanistic version of Maxwell House. Or on Sunday, we'll have the version that I have on PowerPoint slides that we'll share over Zoom, because that's how things work these days, I guess. We do have choices. There are choices throughout Jewish history. People made decisions about what goes in and what comes out and how they read it. And it's supposed to be what we need it to be, not, okay, well, it's in the Maxwell House, so that's what we use. Or it's in the Mishnah Torah, and that's what we use. Johnny Appleseed is back with questions. People have questions?
I just want to make a comment that as I was trying to get my notepad out, this flyer fell out that from a mailing from the Society for Humanistic Judaism. The 4 types of children.
Yes, the Fund for Humanistic Judaism, and it's a little Passover insert. Yeah.
So it has different words for the types of children, Toby, that might be more acceptable.
I have 100 of those in an express mail envelope sitting on my dining room table, which is also my desk, because pandemics are like that. And it's unopened because they're sending me 100 sheets of paper like I'm going to see anybody to give 100 sheets of paper to. I know anybody who's a Mahar member is getting an envelope from the Fund for Humanistic Judaism asking for money, giving you this sheet of paper, so we don't need to mail it out. I don't know. But yeah, there are alternatives. So if you did get, it's a white envelope, the text is green. There is a one-pager in there with alternate approaches to the 4 children.
Yeah, it's got 2 sides too, so it's like 2 pages,
And it's glossy.
Like one, yeah.
Color, yeah. And with their theme colors, the orange and yeah. This is one they designed themselves too. We were surprised it showed up, and oh, we didn't have to do this one.
It looks readable, so I'll look at it later.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess this means that people really want to know about Omer, or who's Omer. There are people named Omer. There's a Holocaust historian named Omer Bartov, for example. But counting the Omer is this thing that happens after Passover. Omer, as I mentioned earlier, is just a biblical unit of measurement. Omer is a sheaf of unthreshed grain, right? So you just reap stalks of grain and bundle them together, and each one of these would be an Omer, right? A sheaf of grain. What are we counting when we count the Omer? We're actually not counting sheaves of grain necessarily. We're counting the days from the second day of Passover until Shavuot, which is 49 days. Why? Because the Torah says so. right? That's behind a lot of what happens in traditional Judaism is the Torah says you're going to do this. So the Torah connects Passover with the beginning of the wheat harvest. So the Torah thinks that you do Passover, and then the second day of Passover, you go right into the fields and you get to work. And wheat grows over the winter, so you lop it off then, and you bring your first sheaf of wheat to the priest at the temple, holds it aloft, and starts the countdown from Passover to Shavuot. This is sometimes called a wave offering because the high priest holds the sheaf up and, waves it around. So if there's no temple to send the sheaf of wheat to, maybe there's no counting the Omer. And there was some debate about whether if you don't count the Omer, you're in really big trouble, right? So I talked about being cut off from your people. That's the consequence ultimately for breaking a biblical commandment. There are rabbinic commandments that are kind of like hedges to keep you from violating a biblical commandment and other kinds of things, right? It's the rabbis who come up with the idea of lighting Hanukkah candles and lighting Shabbat candles. That's not in the Torah anywhere. That's a rabbinic commandment. So the rabbis decide that the Omer should still be counted, even though there's no temple, so we're not going to be waving around sheaves of wheat. But it still occurs. If you look at a traditional Orthodox or conservative Siddur, you will find in the daily services a thing where during the counting of the Omer period, the day in that period is announced. So today is the first day of the counting of the Omer, the second day of the counting of the Omer, the third day. Up to 49, the 50th day is Shavuot, right? So that's the next holiday, which that's how I get you to come next week, because I don't talk to you about Shavuot tonight. I leave it till next week. So you're left at the end of the counting of the Omer wondering what happens next. What happens next is cheesecake. Literally. So count the Omer still occurs and is understood to be each person's obligation. If you lose count, there are things you can do to get the count back, but only so many times, and it gets involved. You're not allowed to directly tell somebody. If a guy walks up to you in synagogue and says, hey, what day is it for counting of the Omer? You can't give him the number. You have to give him, well, yesterday was day X, or tomorrow will be day Y, and he has to do the math himself. Because reasons. Mystical Judaism reinterprets this. Like, what's the point of continuing to do this? Kabbalistic Judaism says, the attributes that we ascribe to God, we have too. So we can use counting the Omer to improve those attributes of ourselves. So this is the tree of life diagram that's used in Kabbalistic Judaism a lot. And you can see it has 10. These are Sephirot. These are aspects of God in Kabbalistic Jewish thought. So the top is Keter, or crown, Chokhmah is wisdom, Binah is knowledge. So this line down the middle shows that there's kind of a balance between the sides. That's the basic idea. And Kabbalistic Judaism said everything below this line, so the first three we're not going to talk about for this, but the ones below, they're in balance with each other in some ways, and they're compounded upon each other in some ways. And so every day in the counting of the Omer, every week in the counting of the Omer is connected to one of these. And then every day in that period is connected to all 7. So the first day of the counting of the Omer is Chesed Shebechesed. The next one is Chesed Shebigvura. The next one is Gvura Shebechesed. So you kind of compound these things, and what you're doing is, according to Kabbalistic Judaism, you are using the counting of the Omer to focus on combinations of traits that you have that are also part of the mystical Godhead and that connect you to God, and that if you work on these things, make you a better person. I'm not telling you that's what actually happens. I'm telling you what the explanation is for the practice. So if you are friends with the right people on Facebook, you will see that they will actually say today is day 1 of the counting of the Omer, Chesed Shebe Chesed, and they'll have a blessing after it or whatever it is. So that's kind of what's happening with the counting of the Omer in modern times. And this is something that's not just done by Hasidic Jews or people who are really, really, really connected into Jewish mysticism. This is part of Jewish renewal, which calls itself Neo-Hasidic, but it is also connected to the Reform movement is doing this now, as it happens. They're trying out new things. So there are Reform synagogues that are starting to do this Chesed Shebe Chesed thing, righteousness that's in righteousness, and compounding traits and things like that. It's interesting, but it does kind of require the idea that you're engaged in Jewish mysticism to really make it work fully. Someday we'll have to actually talk about Jewish mysticism in some organized way. So questions, which can include what was all that chesed stuff, I guess.
Aside from noting it, are there any rituals or communal practices associated with the counting of the Omer?
Not really. So the only big communal practice that gets connected into it is that on the 33rd day of it, Lag BaOmer, the counting of the Omer is understood to be kind of a quasi-mourning period. And nobody has a really good reason why, so they've retrojected an explanation that lots and lots of rabbis and their students were killed by the Romans during this 49-day period, but there was a break in the middle on the 33rd day, and so on that 33rd day you get a break from the mourning stuff, M-O-U-R. You get a break from the mourning stuff, and in Israel it's kind of a party day. So people have bonfires, and you will find that there are a lot of Jews who don't shave, male Jews who won't shave their beards from Passover until Lag BaOmer, and then won't do it again until after, or won't get a haircut, or won't listen to music because it's supposed to be a period of mourning. And it's not tied into anything particular to the value of counting of the Omer itself, but there seems to have been a practice that there was like a break in the middle, and this is what the break becomes. There's also a retrojection of getting ready to receive revelation, because Shavuot, which ends this, is traditionally viewed as the holiday on which the Torah or the 10 Commandments were given to Moses at Sinai. And so there's this idea that these are 50 days of lead up and getting your stuff together in order to be ready to symbolically re-receive revelation. But again, none of this is inherent to what's in the Torah. This is all the rabbis backfilling as a way of maintaining holidays that didn't have obvious rationales anymore, with the disappearance of the temple and with people not living in the land of Israel.
So is Lent a Christian borrowing or variation on the counting of the Omer leading up to the revelation of the resurrection?
So this is interesting. Lent is the period that precedes Easter. So Lent goes from Ash Wednesday through Easter. It doesn't continue afterward. So it's a little bit of an echo in the sense that it's a quasi-mourning period within Christianity too. I don't know that it's a direct taking, because Christianity marks what we would call Shavuot. It calls Pentecost. And Pentecost marks 50 days after Jesus' resurrection. There was a gathering of the disciples, and they were all swept up, according to the New Testament in the book of Acts, they were all swept up in the divine spirit and spoke in tongues. And that was the direct revelation of Jesus' will to the disciples. So that's like Christian Shavuot. But the mourning practices don't exist between those dates. They exist running up to Easter. So it's not a direct adaptation, but there may be some element of it.
On allowed for Omer, isn't that a day you're also allowed to get married?
Yeah, you're technically not supposed to get married during the counting of the Omer. However, if you do get married and it's because you kind of didn't notice, the marriage is not invalid.
Right.
You're just supposed to avoid it.
Tradition.
Right.
And Ami asked a question in the chat. Isn't the Omer barley? I thought Passover was the barley harvest.
Traditionally is barley. However, any of the 5 grains actually work, right? So there's 5 different kinds of grains that grow in the land of Israel traditionally, as the rabbis understand it, and any of those 5 count for that harvest. So wheat, barley, rye, spelt, and oats, I think. All of which, by the way, the Bible calls corn.
Well, corn was a New World thing. It's a
Right. So the word corn is actually like Karen, right? So the word horn in Hebrew turns into corn, cornus in Latin, and just refers to the bit with grains at the end of the stalk, right? So we call it maize, right? It's supposed to be called maize. That's how you distinguish New World corn from all the other stuff. But the Tanakh just kind of routinely refers to all of that stuff as corn, kind of recognizing that the end of the stalk looks like a horn a little bit. Other questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm still hung up on thinking about the communal nature of the holiday,
Mm-hmm.
and what is and what isn't. And it, couple things, but when I think you said what remains, 2 of the commandments that remain are eat matzah and tell the story. And you could eat matzah by yourself, but you can't tell a story by yourself. You have to have somebody to tell it to.
Mm-hmm.
You may have children, you may not have children. There needs to be someone to tell it to, and that suggests to me, if that's one of the 2 main important pillars that are left, that suggests to me, again, a getting together and the communal nature.
Yeah, although, so this is a fun trick. The rabbis say that if you're by yourself, you still have to have a Seder. So they anticipated this. Well, I don't have to do it if I'm like by myself on a ship, right? And the answer is, nope, you do. You're just going to talk to yourself.
Uh-huh. Okay, well, that kills my next argument, which was the idea of a Seder suggests coming together, but
Well,
or at least that's how we look at it today.
I mean, religious stuff is social, right? So
Right.
it's a lot harder to do Jewish stuff if you're totally by yourself. It makes a lot less sense a lot of the time. Um, they want you to do it in community, right? That's why we have minions and things like that. Is you want people to do things in community. It works better. It keeps people together. It keeps people in the religious group that way.
Right.
But at the end of the day, most of these obligations all do boil down to them as it's your job in most cases. Like it's the individual's job to do this stuff. There are only a few kinds of things where if nobody does it, well, nobody has to do it. Like it's not a mother's obligation in the rabbinic world. It's not a mother's obligation to ensure that a child is circumcised. It's the community's obligation. But then there's no person that's really required to do it. It loses the force of this is a thing that has to happen. But yeah, mothers are not required to ensure that children are circumcised. That's the father's job. And then it becomes the community's job if there's no father around. So,
Well, when you described the process of killing the lamb, it it reminded me of the communal, here we go again, the communal nature of putting out a fire, of everybody running to the bucket and passing it along. But I think you described that.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, for the rabbis, Judaism is something done in community and done in family. And, the personal stuff is good and useful and whatever else, but it's not usually the preferred way of doing it. So it is an extremely social approach to these kinds of things.
But better you do it alone versus not do it at all if you have to.
Right.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Okay, well, we are well past 9 o'clock, so if folks want to hang around, that's great, but I don't want people to feel like obliged because I'm sure it's past a lot of people's bedtimes. It's not past my bedtime. I'll be up for hours, but for some people it is.
Well, thanks very much, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Just one comment on Johnny Appleseed. It's probably just was there, but what do we think of Johnny Appleseed's sowing the seeds so you could grow different things, just like telling the story, making it your own story. We're giving you basics so you can sow the seeds, so you can tell your own story.
Yeah, I think that works. I mean, Johnny Appleseed is just in the presentation template. And when I hit the play button to test it, it wasn't there. And now it's back. And I don't understand what happened. I only have any kind of real connection to Johnny Appleseed because I worked in Fort Wayne for a summer and everything in Fort Wayne is named after Johnny Appleseed. That's its claim to fame, I guess. So it's the Tin Hats is the baseball team and whatever else. So, okay.
Okay.
All right. So good night, and I'll
Night.
see everybody
Thank you.
later. Thank you.